My name's Don Mathers. I'm 76 years old, retired from delivering letters down every street of Olathe, Kansas for over 40 years, and I'm sitting here on this old wooden rocker, the one that's lost more paint than it has left, watching. The sun dip behind the rooftops where I once walked my route. There's a smell in the air tonight, something like fresh brewed coffee in a chipped mug and the faint hint of cherry pie sitting on a diner windowsill. At how a whiff of something so simple can yank you right back through time to a day you thought was long gone. I'm thinking about that Friday ritual, how I'd pick up Lynn at 5 sharp, and we'd head over to Maggie's diner for a slice of that pie and a cup of joe so hot it steamed up the windshield of my old Ford. It seems silly, but that smell's been haunting me all week, and tonight it's got me wondering why a memory like that still feels as real as the creak of this rocker beneath me. Around the 20-second mark here, if you're inclined, why not tap that like button or drop a comment below. Subscribe too, if you'd like to hear more of these old bones chattering on No Rush, just if it strikes your fancy. I reckon this story's been weighing on my chest for years, ever since the spring of 2020, when Lynn fell during the worst days of that pandemic. I remember the antiseptic smell of the hospital room, the beeping machines, and her whisper, asking that certain folks stay away. Words that didn't make much sense until she was gone and I was sorting, doer things in that silent house. That's when I found them, little postcards addressed to Mom from children I never knew, and an insurance policy under another name. It hit me like a thunderclap in clear sky, and some part of me still aches with the wonder of it all. Why does it linger in my heart? Maybe because I never saw it coming. I delivered mail to that other home not 2 blocks from here, waved at her through the window many a morning, and I never once suspected. We all go about our days thinking we know the map of our lives, but sometimes there's a secret road running right beside us, hidden by the hedges of routine and trust. It's a quiet night now, cicadas humming in the dark, and I'm left with the question that's been my constant companion. How well do you really know the one you thought you knew best? I can still taste the sweetness of that cherry pie, still hear the clink of ceramic mugs, and that simple memory holds on to me because it was the foundation of everything I believed. But foundations can crack without warning, and when they do, you're left picking through the rubble for any sign of what was real. So here I am, staring into the fading light, trying to make sense of the pieces I still have and the ones I never saw missing. This story keeps me up at night, and I'll be darned if I don't see it through to the end, one word at a time, hoping you'll stick around and see what comes of it. I reckon I was about 8 years old when those first sunlit memories began to stick in my mind, growing up just a few blocks from where I live now. Back in the early 50s, Olathe felt like the very heart of America, prairie winds rolling through empty lots, white picket fences marking neat yards, and the hum of tractors out beyond town on Sunday mornings. My old man had come home from the war not long before I was old enough to toddle after him, his uniform still creased in our front hall closet, and he'd spend his days teaching me to pitch a baseball in the dusty field behind our house. Mama was always humming at him as she ironed his shirts, the press hissing like a kettle at tea time, and I remember the scent of starch and lilies drifting through the kitchen window where she'd bake bread on Thursdays. Life moved steady, like a metronome. You'd wake with the rooster crow, chase the school bus down Maple Street, and by supper you were swapping stories around that formica table beneath that yellowed lamp. I thought back then that kindness was the surest currency in the world. If you tipped your hat to the milkman, offered a neighbor a slice of pie, or just helped an old woman across the corner, you knew you'd done right. My dreams were simple, maybe to grow up and buy a red '49 Ford like the one across the street, or take part in the county fair's pie-eating contest, or perhaps write a letter every week to folks serving overseas so they'd know they weren't alone. I figured people always came back, that if you served them well, they'd circle back in kind someday. That notion carried me through my 20s when I met Lynn, and even up until the day I stumbled onto those postcards from children I'd never known. On Saturday nights, my ma and pa would sit me on the front porch swing, sipping lemonade made from lemons bought down at Carlson's grocery, and pa would point up at the sky and see that star. Son, that's the same one I saw up in Normandy. And I'd close my eyes and feel like the whole universe was narrowing down to a single moment of wonder. It was there, swinging with my legs dangling over the empty lot, that I first promised myself I'd build a life that stood tall, just like that star, dependable, bright, and ever-present. My world then consisted of paper routes, church picnics, high school dances where I nervously asked a girl named Lucy to slow dance under the gym's twinkling lights, and Friday night flickers at the drive-in where 2 movies and a box of popcorn felt like the height of luxury. I believed those days would last forever, that the faces I saw every morning through frosty window panes would never change, and that the promises I made to be kind, to be reliable, to always tip my hat, were enough to carry any man through life untouched by betrayal or loss. There was a rhythm to everything: the school bell at 8 o'clock sharp, the whistle calling me down to fetch the mail for Mrs. Henderson, the oven timer buzzing just when I sat down to supper. Even when I joined the postal service full-time and walked those same streets with a satchel heavy on my shoulder, I felt tethered to that boy I'd been, full of hope and convinced that love was as straightforward as a straight road. Now, leaning back in this rocker and replaying those days, I can almost hear Mama's piano tinkling down the hallway and Pa's soft chuckle as I trip over my own shoelaces trying to impress a girl. I remember feeling invincible, too young to know the cracks that would form in the foundation of my life, the ones I never suspected until they yawned wide open in 2020. But in that child's world, I believed that all good deeds boomeranged right back to you, and that every farewell meant you'd see someone again. I believed that until I didn't, and in that unshakable faith, I carried the seed of a heartbreak that would bloom 3 decades later, right here on these very streets I thought I knew so well. I remember the summer of 1952 like it was yesterday, though my knees creak more these days than they did back then. I was 20 years old, fresh-faced and full of dreams, carrying my mailbag down Cedar Street when I first laid eyes on her. It was a bright Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the sun seems to pause overhead just to watch you go about your business, and there she was on her front porch, nursing a glass of lemonade like it was a secret elixir. I couldn't explain why my heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was the way the light caught her auburn hair, or the gentle tilt of her head as she lifted that ragged straw to her lips. All I knew was that I stopped cold in my tracks, mail in hand, and stared until the world of envelopes and addresses blurred around me. I didn't dare speak at first. I delivered mail to plenty of homes, but I'd never before felt like the letters in my bag were suddenly meaningless. Lynn smiled then, just a small, knowing curve of her lips, and I felt something stir inside me that I wouldn't understand until years later. I was a simple fellow, raised on kindness and fair deals, so I tipped my cap and cleared my throat, trying to sound casual. "Afternoon, miss," I said, voice a notch higher than I'd have liked. She waved me over, and I told myself I'd been through more nerve-jangling moments, meeting the postmaster on my first route, kissing my mother goodbye before heading off to college, but this felt different, like stepping off a cliff into a sky full of stars. She asked if I'd ride over and pick up some pie from Maggie's diner for her and her sister, and I swore I carried that pie home like it was made of diamonds. On the porch swing, she introduced herself, Lynn Carter, and I mumbled my name, promising I'd be back Friday at 5 for coffee and that pie if she'd have me. It was as simple as that. But in that moment, I felt the world shift on its axis. I went back to my route, but I wasn't delivering mail anymore. I was delivering hope, carrying an extra weight of possibility in my satchel. That afternoon I rode home slower than usual, the engine of my Ford humming a lullaby, and I couldn't wait to tell Ma and Pa about the girl on Cedar Street who made my knees ache and my thoughts wander. Later, I learned that she'd just moved to town, working nights at the clinic and spending days with her sister. But back then she might as well have been from another planet. I remember thinking, my goodness, how did she end up 2 blocks from my house? The answer didn't matter. What mattered was the spark that ignited that day. An ordinary delivery turned extraordinary by a simple wave and a smile. In the days that followed, I found myself looking forward to that Friday more than any holiday, more than my birthday, even more than the county fair. Every step down Cedar Street felt like walking on clouds, and every letter I sorted paled in comparison to the thought of seeing her again. That moment changed everything because it taught me something I'd never known, that love can arrive unannounced, like a breeze carrying the scent of cherry pie straight to your heart, and that a single encounter has the power to reroute the course of your life. I couldn't explain it then, and I still find it hard to put into words, but I knew I had to learn more about this woman who made me believe that some surprises are worth every risk. And as it turned out, that risk would lead me down a path I never expected, one that would test every bit of the kindness and trust one thought I understood, and leave me wondering how well we ever really know the people we choose to love. When Lynn passed away in that sterile hospital room in the spring of 2020, I thought the hardest part would be learning to breathe again without her gentle voice beside me, but I had no idea the real struggle was only just beginning. I came home to an empty house on Oak Street, the rooms echoing with memories of our Friday nights at Maggie's and the soft click of her heels as she padded through the kitchen. It was quiet in a way that hurt your ears, and every little sound, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, seemed to remind me that she was gone. My children called, offering condolences and asking if I needed anything. I appreciated their concern, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them that what I needed wasn't a fresh loaf of bread or someone to mow the lawn, but answers to questions I didn't even know how to ask. I buried myself in her things, sifting through linens that still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume, until I came across those postcards, brightly colored with childish scrawl, addressed to Mom. My hand shook so badly I nearly dropped them, and when I spotted that insurance policy under a name I'd never heard, I felt a cold wave wash over me, like I'd fallen through the ice on a winter pond. I sat in Lynn's rocking chair for hours, staring at the cards, repeating in my mind how many times I'd driven past that other house 2 blocks down, delivering mail while she'd waved at me through the window, and never once imagining she was living 2 lives. The neighbors noticed I stopped going to church, stopped waving back when I passed them by, and I could almost read the questions behind their polite eyes. Is he all right? Did she leave him? I didn't have the heart to tell them the truth, that she hadn't left me, she'd hidden me. Inside, I felt a storm of anger and betrayal, as if each postcard and each line of that policy was a slap I couldn't refuse. I was ashamed, too ashamed to admit that I'd built my life on a half-truth, and I couldn't stop replaying every moment, her smile in the diner booth, the scent of cherry pie, her soft good night every Friday, wondering if it had ever meant what I thought it meant. Friends offered to drive out for coffee, but I declined. I was too afraid that if someone asked what was on my mind, I might break down, confess everything, and watch their faces fall in confusion and pity. Nights found me awake in that same rocker, Duke curled at my feet, as I wrestled with the knowledge that I'd been living a lie as dependable as the sunrise. What could I do? Confront Carl, the man I'd later learned believed Lynn was a divorcee working extra shifts, bury the past and pretend it normalcy, or chase the truth all the way down, no matter how much rubble it left behind? The weight of the unknown pressed against my chest, and I realized that my routine life of letters and routes had been replaced by a journey into uncertainty. I had lost my anchor, and every creak of the house felt like a warning. The person I thought I knew best was a stranger, and in the emptiness she left, I was forced to reckon with the hardest truth of all, that life doesn't always follow the map you draw for it. And sometimes the ground beneath you shifts without warning, leaving you stumbling in the shadows, searching for a way back to solid earth. I remember stepping into that yellow brick chapel on that damp spring morning and feeling the weight of every footstep slow to a crawl, as if the world itself had paused to watch what would unfold. The pews were filled with neighbors I'd waved to for decades, faces I once believed knew me as well as I knew them, yet in that moment they all blurred into a sea of muted sorrow. I carried her favorite scarf in my trembling hand, the one she'd knit last Christmas, and when I laid it gently across her casket, my heart felt hollow, as if I'd placed my own soul beside her. Then I saw him, a man I'd never met, standing off to the side, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on a young woman at his elbow. She looked no older than 30, her brown hair pulled back tight, and she clung to his arm as though he were the last anchor in a stormy sea. I watched her whisper something I couldn't hear, then reach out and brush a tear from his cheek, murmuring "Mom," like a secret the walls themselves ought to keep. Tom stopped right there. The hymnal I'd held under my arm slipped to the floor, pages splaying like wounded birds, and I could hear only the thump of my own heart drumming an urgent warning in my ears. I remember the world tilting sideways, how the bright stained glass windows felt like they'd melted into tears, and how every face in the room turned toward me as if waiting for an explanation I didn't have. I found myself walking across the aisle without meaning to, each step carrying me toward a truth I feared more than any darkness I'd ever known. When I stood before him, Carl was his name. I'd learned later, his eyes were wide with confusion, and he looked at me as though I'd sprung from the floorboards. I could see the moment he recognized me from some long-forgotten delivery route, the shock rippling across his face like a pebble dropped in still water. In that instant, I felt the ground give way beneath me, as if every letter I'd ever delivered, every promise I'd ever whispered to Lynn in that diner booth, had been nothing but an illusion. I opened my mouth, intending to speak, but no words came, only a whisper of air rattling in my throat. Finally, I managed. Seems like we shared more than a zip code. My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. He blinked, swallowed hard, then shook his head as if to clear it, before stepping forward and wrapping me in a hug so fierce I thought my ribs might crack. And there in that embrace, with the chapel's silence save for the muffled sobs around us, I realized the true breadth of what I'd lost, not just Lynn's company, but the certainty that had anchored my world for 42 years. I lost the simple faith that what I saw was what I got, the belief that the one you love is always the one you know. In its place grew a heavy garden of questions. How long had she been leading this double life, and why had she kept it hidden so well? How many times had I passed her window without seeing the other family she held in her heart? That moment changed me deeper than any trial I'd faced on my old mail route. I left that chapel not just a widower, but a man unmoored, carrying the weight of a secret I never wanted and a betrayal that cut deeper than any wound. And yet, in that new emptiness, something stirred, a resolve to seek out the shards of truth, to find Carl's children and look them in the eye, and to learn whether forgiveness might one day patch the fractures in a heart that once believed love was a simple path. After I left that chapel, I stepped into a silence so thick it felt like it coated every corner of my home. The halls I once walked humming with Lynn's laughter now closed in on me like the final pages of a book I wasn't ready to finish. For the first few nights, I barely slept. My chair on the porch stayed empty of conversation as Duke curled up by the door. The dishes piled up in the sink, the mail I once delivered with pride sat unsorted on the hall table. I found myself wandering room to room, as if I expected to find a clue, her scarf hanging crookedly, an open book she'd set aside, or the faint aroma of cherry pie drifting from the kitchen. But there was nothing, just the echo of memories. My world grew smaller. I stopped going down to the corner store, stopped waving at neighbors who offered quiet condolences. I skipped church on Sunday, telling the pastor I needed time, but I wasn't sure from what. The idea that kindness always boomeranged back to you felt foolish now, like expecting the sun to rise at noon. I believed in simple truths, that trust was unbreakable, that promises were bonds stronger than steel. All of that seemed fragile now, like a window pane cracked by a stone's toss. In those weeks, I lost something I didn't even know I had until it was gone, my sense of place in the world. The postman's route I'd walked for 40 years vanished from my memory. The map of every street looked strange under a gray sky. My hands, once steady enough to fold letters neatly, shook when I tried to fill out the forms to transfer the life insurance to her estate. Each stroke of the pen felt like betraying a vow. Some days I'd sit on the front porch, Duke at my feet, rocking slowly, watching the sun set behind the rooftops where Lynn and I had walked side by side. Those sunsets held no comfort anymore. I found myself glancing down the street toward the house 2 blocks away, half expecting to see lights come on, to see that other life I'd been blind to, but the windows stayed dark. I wondered if Carl ever stared back at my house with the same hope. I tried to read, to fill the hours with something other than grief, but my mind would wander back to the moment I laid that scarf on her casket. I remembered the hush in the chapel, the soft crack of my heart opening to the cold. Plenty of folks said time heals all wounds, but they never told you how it can soothe the edges of pain until you forget what you lost in the first place. I feared forgetting Lynn's laugh, her rhythm of speech, the way she'd tap my arm when she had something to say. Eventually, I let the eyes thaw just enough to function. I started clearing out the garage, stacking old tools and rusted pieces of the postal bike I rode in my youth. With each box I labeled, I felt a stitch pull tighter in my chest. But at least my hands were busy. Duke's collar jingled as he nosed at my feet, reminding me that someone still needed me. There is a kind of comfort in routine. even when routine comes with a hollow echo. Little by little, I rediscovered small joys: a cup of coffee at sunrise, the creak of the rocker beneath me, the neighbor kid bouncing a ball in the driveway that reminded me of my own boy gone years ago. My faith in people dimmed but did not vanish. I learned that trust is not a light switch you can flip back on at will. It's a dimmer, and sometimes you must live in twilight before you can see in daylight again. So here I sit now, on that same porch, the house settled around me like a patient friend. I'm not the same man I was before the truth found me. I carry new questions instead of certainties, but I found a measure of peace in the quiet. The world feels different, colder in some corners, but brighter in others where the sun still breaks through the clouds, and I reckon that's how it ought to be after loss. The echoes that once haunted me have softened into reminders of what once was and what might still be, if I'm brave enough to keep living. I reckon it was one of those mornings when I half expected the sun not to bother rising, but Duke lifted his head from the rug and let out a greeting bark that reminded me I still had a job to do, even if that job was just to keep breathing. I sat up slow as molasses, wrapped my hands around that chipped coffee mug, and stared out the kitchen window at the dew on the lawn. That's when I noticed Mrs. Henderson next door wrestling with her grocery bags, the handles cutting into her fingers like they'd forgotten what kindness felt like. Something in me stirred. Maybe it was Lynn's voice whispering in the back of my mind about lending a hand to those who needed. Maybe it was something deeper, but I stood up, slid into my old loafers, and walked right over. I don't know when I last offered unsolicited help to a neighbor, but as I carried her bags inside and settled her at the kitchen table, I felt a spark of purpose I hadn't known in months. Her grateful smile was all the thanks I needed to realize that a small kindness could rattle the cage of my loneliness and free a part of me I thought was lost forever. That afternoon, back on my porch rocker, I found myself humming a tune Lynn used to sing, feeling something like hope creep back into my bones. The next day, I dusted off my postal satchel, the one I'd hung on its hook and left there ever since 2020, and I walked down to the post office, offering to sort mail for old Mrs. Carter who'd lost both her arms to arthritis. I told the postmaster I wasn't after money, just something to occupy my mind. To my surprise, he nodded and handed me a stack of letters, and for the first time since the truth upended my world, I felt useful again, sort of like slipping on an old glove that still fit. A week later, I got a letter from Sally, Lynn's younger daughter, the one who'd clung to Carl's arm at the chapel, and she asked if I'd help her scan some old family photos for a project she was putting together. I half hesitated, wondering if I had the nerve to face that part of Lynn's life, but something told me this was the chance to stitch together the torn edges of two families. So I went over and spent an afternoon flipping through yellowed snapshots, telling stories to Sally about the day Lynn baked her first pie, and the time we got lost on a road trip and ended up watching the 4th of July fireworks in a cornfield. She laughed and cried in the same breath, and in her eyes I saw a reflection of Lynn's gentle spirit, a spirit I thought I'd lost, only to find it flickering to life again. In helping her, I found a second shot at connection, a way to honor the woman I loved by keeping her memory alive in new hearts. That's when I realized that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending the betrayal never happened. It was about using what I'd learned: kindness, reliability, and the stubborn hope that people can still surprise you, to build something new. These days, I start each morning with Duke at my heels, helping Mrs. Henderson with her groceries, sorting mail for the post office, and meeting Sally for coffee at Maggie's on Fridays. The same ritual I shared with Lynn, only now it includes another generation. My world is widened again, not patched up like a leaky roof, but reforged into something stronger. I still carry the ache of discovery in my chest, and I still ponder the secret roads we never knew we traveled, but I found that when you offer a hand, you can lift more than just a bag of groceries. You can lift a heart, maybe even your own. And so, here in the quiet hum of Olathe, I've come to realize that a new beginning can start with the smallest act of kindness, and that sometimes a second chance looks a lot like an old man carrying groceries 2 blocks away. I stood in the center of that dusty living room, sunlight slanting through the curtains and catching the motes of dust like tiny fireflies dancing in the air, and for the first time in years, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. In my hand was the old wooden box I'd kept under the bed, the one where I'd stashed Lynn's letters, the postcards from those children I never knew, and that insurance policy with her other name. I've been too afraid to open it, too afraid to let the past spill out across the floor. But today felt different. I felt the tug of all those memories, sweet and bitter, pulling at me, and I knew it was time to decide. I slid the lid off and let those papers tumble into my lap, each one a fragment of a life I thought I understood. I closed my eyes and let the tears come, not the hot, angry tears of betrayal, but the slow, steady tears of release, the kind that come when you finally admit you can't change what happened, but you can decide what comes next. When the sobs quieted, I set the box on the floor, reached down, and poured its contents into the fireplace I'd installed last winter. The letters curled and darkened at the edges, the postcards blackening into ash, and I watched until nothing remained but faint gray smoke drifting up the chimney. It wasn't erasing Lynn or her other life, it was honoring them by letting them go. I turned away from the hearth, where the last flicker of flame winked out, and I felt something settle in my chest, a calm I hadn't known since before 2020. I knew then what I had to do. I chose to live on, without bitterness, without regret, just on. After that day, I didn't sell the house or climb into another rut of sorrow. Instead, I stepped out onto the porch with Duke trotting at my heels, and together we watched the dawn light stretch across the fields. I reopened my satchel and returned to the post office, not because I needed the routine, but because I needed the connection, the small nod from the clerk, the grateful wave from a neighbor who'd misplaced their mail, the handful of letters that reminded me people still trusted me to carry their stories. I started writing again, not to Lynn, but to my grandchildren, letters filled with tales of cherry pie and porch swings, letters I mailed every Friday just as I used to deliver Lynn's pie. And I called Sally, inviting her over to plant a flower bed along the walkway where Lynn once arranged bouquets each spring. We dug our hands into the soil, planting marigolds and daisies in neat rows, and when the sweat dripped down my neck, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. I realized that the past didn't have to be a shackle around my ankles. It could be the soil that nourished my future. Forgiveness of Lynn, of myself for not seeing the signs, of Carl who'd been just as much in the dark, became my secret fertilizer, helping me grow something new in the garden of my life. Now, when I sit in that old rocker and feel the breeze rustle through the leaves, I carry both joy and sorrow in my heart like two old friends sharing a quiet bench. Often, I'll whisper into the air, "Thank you," not because I understand it all, but because I accept it, and acceptance tastes sweeter than any pie I've ever had. And as the sun dips low each evening, I look out at the two houses on our street, mine and the one 2 blocks down, and I remind myself that our stories may run in parallel, two lives bound by geography but separated by secrets. Mine is a story I choose to live out loud now, with no hidden chapters, just an honest turn of the page. I'm not the man I was, but I'm the man I am, and that's enough. I spent years believing that the simplest acts, delivering mail, sharing pie, keeping promises, were all the life lessons a man needed. But what I've learned after walking through that betrayal and back isn't a trite moral about always check the fine print. It's a deeper truth. We build our lives around the people we love, and sometimes those foundations shift without whispering a warning. I understood, in the rubble of my world, that trust isn't a contract stamped in ink. It's a dance built on curiosity and questions, and if we stop asking, we stop truly knowing. I delivered letters for 40 years in Olathe, Kansas, thinking I knew every house on my route, but I never once knocked on the back door to see who answered. I thought kindness alone would light the path, but I needed courage, too, the courage to look beyond the familiar, to ask hard questions when something didn't add up, and to face truths that might hurt. I discovered that love isn't proof against secrets, it's proof that secrets can cut deeper than any weapon. And yet, I also found that love can heal when we let it guide us toward forgiveness instead of bitterness. Today, when I see my neighbors across those two familiar blocks, I remember that people carry whole worlds behind their front doors, stories they share freely and others they guard fiercely. I've learned to listen with more than my ears, to watch for the small gestures, the way someone hesitates before they speak, the way a letter is folded, the way a smile falters for a heartbeat. Because the world I thought was unchanging turned out to be woven from moments we never question. So I urge you, Don't let routine blind you to the mystery in the people you care for. Ask the questions that feel awkward, look through the windows you've always walked past, and don't be afraid of the answers. If you build your life on curiosity as much as kindness, you'll be ready for the cracks when they come. You'll know that the deepest wounds aren't caused by what someone does to us, but by what we don't see coming. And if you choose forgiveness over bitterness, your heart will grow stronger, not hard. My journey taught me that acceptance isn't giving in. It's choosing to shape the pieces of your story, broken or whole, into something honest and alive. It's choosing to live with hands unclenched and eyes open. Even when you're scared, you might see something you'd rather ignore. I'm no longer the man who believed a man's word was enough. I'm the man who knows that words are just the beginning, and actions honest. Actions are how we write the rest of our lives. So perhaps it's time for you to stop waiting for life to unfold exactly as you planned, and start inviting the questions that shake you awake. Perhaps it's time you stopped waiting for answers to come to you and began to seek them out. Because the only way to know what's true is to look for it yourself, and that is a lesson worth more than any promise. Now, as I sit here in this old rocker, Duke curled up beside me in the evening breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass through the screen door, I realized that this story, my story, is not just about a secret that surfaced decades too late, but about every one of us who's ever believed in something so deeply that we never thought to question its roots. It's about waking up one morning to find the ground has shifted beneath your feet and wondering whether you can learn to stand again on unfamiliar soil. It's about the moments we cling to, the Friday pie at Maggie's, the gentle goodnight whispered after a long day, and discovering, sometimes painfully, that memories can both comfort and haunt us. I want you to feel the weight of that rocker leaning back, the creak of the wood under the dusk light, and imagine the echo of my own heartbeat as I laid Lynn's letters on the hearth and watched them turn to ash. Because that moment, where I chose to let go rather than hold on to bitterness, became the bridge between who I was and who I could become. And in that choice, I found a quiet strength I never knew I had, a strength born of forgiveness and the stubborn hope that what's broken can still be set right, even if it's never the same again. So I ask you now, as the sun dips low and the sky softens into shades of gold and lavender, to look at your own life and ask yourself, what truths have you taken for granted, and what questions have you been too afraid to ask? What moments have you shelved away, waiting for a time that may never come, when perhaps you could face them without flinching? And what would happen if, like me, you decided that your past, no matter how tangled or painful, isn't the final word on who you are? Could you find it in your heart to forgive the secrets, to tend the garden of your days with kinder hands, and to let new blooms rise from the ashes of old hurts? I can't tell you the easy answer, but I can share the quiet promise I made to myself that day by the fire. I would live on, with an open heart, leaving space for both sorrow and joy to reside. I would carry the lessons of those two houses on the same street, my own and the one 2 blocks away, like worn maps guiding me toward compassion instead of blame. And I would believe, however tentatively at first, that love, true love, doesn't always fit the shape we expect, but it has a way of circling back, sometimes in the faces of neighbors we help, in the laughter of grandchildren we hadn't known, and in the whispering wind that carries a memory across the years. So tell me, friend, what do you think? Should true love come back? Sometimes I think she still remembers.